Now there's a car that just asks to be driven. Mercury is bringing a sophisticated new shape to the American road. Introducing Sable. Mercury, the shape you want to be in.
The 1986 Mercury Sable, one of the most dramatically new vehicles of the 1980s, and a car that really showed Ford was embracing aerodynamic styling at a time when the competitors like GM and Chrysler were still creating vehicles that had the so-called sheer look, kind of slab-sided, boxy styling. Remember at the time the Sable was introduced that it was so stunningly dramatic and different from what, for example, General Motors was producing. In the previous model year, 1985, GM had introduced its full-size C-bodies, its first full-size transversely mounted engine and transmission front-wheel drive cars, the Olds 98, Buick Electra, and Cadillac DeVille and Fleetwood. The Sable was such an amazing departure from these vehicles, and GM was still espousing a pretty anachronistic styling philosophy at the time that included vertical backlights and C-pillars, very similar to the successful 1976 to 79 Seville, low belt lines with large amounts of glass, and overall sheer surfacing that was quite similar to the vehicles that had preceded them, although the 1985 models were significantly smaller than, for example, the 1984 full-size Olds 98 Buick Electra, as well as the Cadillac DeVille and Fleetwood. Interestingly, General Motors was the first of the big three to build a full-size wind tunnel on site at its GM Technical Center, where full-size vehicles could be tested in the wind tunnel to help them be shaped for better aerodynamics. Despite the wind tunnel, Ford was actually the one that pioneered more aerodynamic styling when it came to the domestic auto companies, launching in 1983 the Aerobird, Thunderbird, and Cougar. This was followed shortly thereafter by the 1984 Mark VII. The Tempo and Topaz were also introduced by Ford in this aero vein, and all the vehicles that I mentioned had the so-called aircraft or fuselage-like doors that opened into the roof. GM had employed a similar aircraft-style door on the Cadillacs that came out in 1985, but the Olds and the Buick did not have that. In any case, when the Sable was introduced for 1986, it represented a dramatic departure from what Americans were typically used to when it came to full-size sedans. And it did also have, by the way, those aircraft-style doors. Take a look here at this 1986 Mercury Sable, and you can see just how futuristic this car was. For instance, it appears that its super light and thin roof is just floating on top of a ton of glass. It looks like the Sable's greenhouse just wraps all the way around, including the C-pillar, which is glass, although there is some blackout trim on the adjoining areas with the backlight as well as the rear door. Nonetheless, it's definitely a dramatically different look from what was espoused by, as mentioned, the other auto companies at the time, where the C-pillar was a pretty pronounced and metallic form as opposed to being this airy glass panel. The Sable also had a number of interesting styling features, some of which differed from its sibling, the Taurus. This included that rib-like styling on the bottom, something that, for whatever reason, designers just really enjoyed. This was originally introduced on some earlier Mercedes, and it migrated to not only the Mercury here, but even the 1986 Cadillac Seville door lowers, and one could even argue the 1985 Pontiac Grand Am, and later all the Pontiacs with the so-called guardrail styling that would continue on for many years. They all were variations of that original Mercedes theme. The Sable also had a significant difference in its rear quarter panel in that the rear wheel was kind of semi-skirted. The Taurus had a full wheel arch in the rear, and so that was one of the minor differences. I don't know that it was major enough for many people to notice, but it was there. I love the Sable's almost full-width taillights as well, only broken up by the license plate in the middle. As if you didn't have to have a license plate, perhaps those taillights would have extended all the way across. Also pretty handsome aluminum wheels on this Sable, especially for the time. Somewhat similar to BBS wheels, but in a novel design, I would say, as well. Here's a driver's side view of the Sable, and you can see a few other features here like the body color mirrors, this bumper protective rub strip that wraps around all the way back to the front wheel, the wraparound headlamps that were novel for the time period. Remember, this was 1986, and General Motors still was not using composite front headlamps. They had been convinced that sealed beam headlamps were the only type of headlamps that the government was going to approve for lighting standards until Lincoln introduced the 1984 Mark VII, which was the first American vehicle to have composite lamps. Of course, the Sable not only had composite headlamps, but had the super cool light bar grille that would become ultra trendy at the time, even though it was hard to really find a Sable that had all of the lights illuminated in the light bar grille. Seems like there was always one that was burned out, or maybe multiple that were burned out. But other cars copied this style, including the 1988 Grand Prix, and even later the Mercury Villager. With that light bar up front, the front end of the car almost looked like it was a spaceship. And I think it was a super cool styling element. I also liked how the grille was incorporated into the bumper and not up high where it would have had to take away from that light bar form. On the inside, the Sable also had a very futuristic interior, which was similar but different from the 1986 Taurus. There was a very pronounced emphasis on ergonomics in the 86 Sable's interior, and you can see this in the door panels, where the door handle as well as the window switch were purposefully placed where they were easy to reach, as well as the door pull there, so that anybody could easily close the door. There also were steering wheel controls for the cruise control, and all of the various buttons and switches were very intuitive to employ. This was one of the earlier applications of rotary knobs and dials at a time when many American car companies were still employing slider bars for climate control. Mercury and Ford in their Taurus elected to use more European-style controls for the interiors. Of course, it was the 1980s, and so you had to be able to get a digital dash in your Sable, which you can see here, kind of, well, cool and, I don't know, somewhat dated looking, with a big digital speedometer, a rising tachometer there, a information center, and a standard fuel and temperature gauge, but there are a series of buttons off to the right where you could check a number of different functions in that display area at the left. One interesting tidbit was that the Sable interior ended up having this kind of faux wood grain associated with it, and that was not part of the original design proposal for the Sable interior. It was simply added given the success of some of Ford's older mainline cars like the Mercury Grand Marquis and the Ford Crown Victoria. It was felt that the interior and exterior of the Sable might have been a little bit too harsh for the typical Mercury buyer, and so designers at the last minute spruced them up with some faux wood grain. And what says luxury like faux wood grain? Well, nothing else, especially in your Mercury. Now, one interesting debate about the Sable is whether or not it really represents an Americanization of the 1983 Audi 5000, or sometimes called the 100, that you see here. The 5000, I think, is one of the best-looking cars produced in the 1980s, and you can see that it just had such dramatically different style, again, from what most of the domestic auto companies were producing. Think about a Mercury Grand Marquis juxtaposed against this Audi 5000. They're just two totally different cars. And I have to admit that the Sable does bear more than a passing resemblance to the Audi 5000, but I think it has enough different about it to really suggest that perhaps while it inspired the Sable as well as the Taurus, the designers at Ford really didn't copy it and came up with something that was their own. To that end, here are a few sketches of what designers were thinking for the 1986 Sable before it came out. Notice that there is a striking similarity in this vehicle compared to the previously shown production model, namely the upper portion with its super glassy area. You can see here is one of the main themes, although this does have vertical tail lamps, which clearly the production car didn't have. And there also are some pretty pronounced bulges around the wheels that didn't make it through to production either. But that upper theme on this particular sketch is pretty similar to what would make it into production. And here you have a sketch done that really resembles the production model. This might, I wonder if it was even done very close to the car's completion, or perhaps even afterward, as it's just so similar. If not, this is a great sketch that suggests where the design was going. I will say that there are some differences. You notice that the grille and the bumper is very different here. It's just kind of a single inlet in the middle, and it's not quite clear if this has the light bar grille or what's going on up front. And clearly the wheels are, well, let's just say dramatically different than the production model, but nonetheless a cool sketch. And here's an early model in Ford's design studios. You can see that this particular model does have that glassy upper, although the doors don't quite have the same opening into the roof that the final car would have. The A-pillar, the B-pillar, the C-pillar is different. And of course, the front has sealed beam headlamps, does not have the light bar grille. It does kind of have a little bit of a grille in the bumper, but not like what the final car would have. There's no ribs on the side of this particular vehicle, and the wheels are obviously different. So you can see this is dated November 23rd, 1981, a number of years before the Sable would make it through to production. I suspect that the Sable's introduction was delayed in part by capital constraints, as Ford Motor Company was going through some challenging financial times during this time period. Let's take a look now at this alternate model with the same date, which suggests to me that these were two different design proposals for the same car. This one is much more clearly akin to what would be introduced to the public. Although here, notice that that rear wheel is not skirted, although it was on the previous model. So my guess is that Ford designers took that element from the previous model, put it on this one, and kind of made the final production car up. Because this one has many different elements of the production car, including that front end, the light bar grille, the composite headlamps, which I'm admittedly surprised to see Ford was toying with in 1981, and the grille integrated into the bumper. You can also see out back that the tail lamps appear to wrap around the side like they would on the final model. In any case, the final Sable that would make it to the market was one of the most dramatic vehicles of the 1980s, and it's still a looker today. They were relatively mechanically reliable, came standard with a 2.5-liter four-cylinder, and optional was an all-new 3-liter V6. They were paired with Ford's 4-speed automatic overdrive transmission. Again, it was a relatively decent engine and transmission combination. Ford was having some transmission problems during this time frame, but both engines were okay, I would say, overall. The four-cylinder sometimes had some head gasket issues. But still, a awesome, revolutionary vehicle for the time. I wish that you could find one of these in great shape. Unfortunately, they were just used and abused and discarded. I saw one actually in the parking lot of my local gym, and it was in pristine shape, had a California license plate in the Midwest, and I went up to it and was oogling it, and the owner came out. It was clearly a hand-me-down car, and he was wondering why I was looking at his Sable. I asked him if he wanted to sell it, and he politely declined and gave me a very confused look, as though he was internally saying, why in the world would this individual want to buy this hand-me-down car? But it was pretty sweet, and I probably would have been more aggressive in the proposal if it hadn't been white, which is not my favorite color for the Sable. If it had been a dark color, probably would have made an offer on it. Let's now close out with a pretty sweet ad for the 1986 Sable wagon, a pretty sweet vehicle overall, and it has a great Joe Cocker tune associated with this advertisement. Take a look and hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the 1986 Mercury Sable.
also happens to be a wagon.
You are so
Introducing Sable. Mercury, the shape